Thanks for reaching out. I think your topic is really cool, and there's many different ways of describing it. And so I wanted to show you my method that I would use that maybe can help you. Um, but if this isn't the trick, let me know. We can work further. So the first thing I did is I took your problem statement and I was like, what are other ways of describing this? And I thought, well, social work, that one's pretty established. There's no synonyms or related terms to that one. That one's pretty canon. And it was interesting because when I found the literature, uh, this one maybe narrowed it down too much. I'll talk about that in a minute. But then I thought, well, if I'm a social work person and I have a crew of people that I'm working with, what do I do? Sometimes it's education, but sometimes it's training. They used to call it sensitivity training, which is just like, what? But I remember training was a big deal. Retraining, I don't know, but education or teaching. Training is a big one. So if you have employees that, for example, they just put out a university one on, what was it? We had to do this class as a university employee. And essentially it was just like this little module that you went through and absolved the university of any legal obligation that you hadn't done the training. So it wasn't very hands-on, but it was just kind of like, hey, be aware of this going on. I can't remember what that was. That happens all the time. And I think you're interested in more of like the hands-on stuff. So for what it's worth, education is formal, teaching is less formal, and training is more related to a trade or an employment. So I thought each one of those keywords would work. And I put the or in between so it would look for any of those. And then I thought, well, I've heard of colorism, but how is it described in the literature, especially with groups who are activists and they want to change the world for the better, maybe activists, maybe political components. And I found all of these different things. And I thought it was interesting because discrimination and prejudice are part of this, but if I looked for that, then it goes off on these other tangents. So how do I get around that? If we tie this key phrase to this one, then it pulls us into that moment where it narrows down to those things specifically. So if you're doing education, teaching, or training related to darker skin, that's going to probably inherently catch the prejudice and discrimination. At any rate, let's do a search. So I'm going to go over to the library catalog, and I have 3 databases that I would like to show you that might work well. If you go to databases, I have a list that a curated list that I have in a resource called a research guide, but I'll do you the short version here. So the first one is, let us go to, if you just go to social work, the scope of social work in literature is, the scope is rather small. And the reason being is that it's a trade and practice that's wildly multidisciplinary. They do a lot of psychology, they do a lot of education, they do public policy and all these different things. So I would say that if you look in, there's like a social work abstracts. If you go here, it's going to be rather limited. But if you go into the top, we don't need social work as a keyword, but we can just do education or teaching or training. Whoops. And then we want it to be related to any one of these terms in the second line. And the important thing is this and right there. That means it's going to catch the first concept, and then only everything that comes in with the second concept is going to show up, if that makes sense. I'm getting figurative and whatnot. So there's only 4. What's up with that? I mean, there's some good stuff, but why is it so thin? Well, let's leave this discipline altogether and go to the other ones that I was talking about. Education, psychology, public policy. So I'll go to education. And instead of narrowing it down to just social work, let's look at all of education. So if you're a social work person, you would go into education disciplines and you wouldn't have to contextualize it with social work per se. You could just say, I want to teach and train related to this topic. So let's do the same search. And on this one, since we're in an education database, we don't need the word education, but I'm lazy and I'm just going to throw it in. And I'm not putting in social work because these are expert and professional trainers. All of a sudden there's 325. And this is from the context of somebody who's a professional in teaching. And some of these are really good. You could also go down to subject and see, are there any other ways that they're talking about it? Racial bias, skin color, I already covered that one. Racial differences, attitudes, it's not necessarily that physical appearance of skin tone or perception. So I think our keywords were pretty good. Education full text. Let's look at psychology. Psychologists are going to be looking at a lot of the stuff that social workers do. PsycInfo. I just had a peanut butter and Nutella bagel, and I'm singing. Psychology is good because it has a lot of the practice, and they do quantitative and qualitative sample sizes and then analyze it through psychological theory. So we could find out, well, what's going on? Why do people have these biases? And so this might be more of the theoretical, but if we're doing education, teaching, or training, that it might be like, maybe you should try this, maybe you should try this. 274. And all of a sudden we have like a new keyword, melanin. So we could add that to our keywords. Melanin. But here they use some of the same ones. The markings of fate. Oh, so they're looking at like the prejudice, personal bias, pedagogical implications for teacher education. Dun, dun, dun. So some of that groundwork stuff. I'm hoping this isn't stuff that you've already found. I'm hoping your first one where you're just like, why did I only get 4? Last one that I wanted to show you is public policy. This one gets overlooked a lot. But there are governments, international, national, but also the local and granular, like county and city and town governments will show up in this one. So if we do, where's political? Oh, here we go, public administration. The top one, that I like is called PAIS. PAIS is where a government has implemented something, and then they write up a report and publish it. Or scholars will analyze things like that. And we can also go to the advanced search. So San Francisco, maybe Paris. There are entities around the world. Oh, I forgot to put in the or. There are governments around the world who are working on problems. And I think they're working on this as well. I mean, you could try it without the education or teaching or training, but it might be just observations of prejudice and discrimination. But let's see what we have here. We've moved beyond sensitivity training, which is such a privileged thing to say. It's colonial, and so this is more post-colonial. Cool. Oh yeah, look at that. So like skin color, income, and blood pressure, that might be beyond the scope of what you're looking for. But demographic changes, skin color and race, social classification. So it's kind of like picking at the pieces. So if you were doing an annotated bibliography, you could look at all, and so instead of just like 8 articles on training, you could look at like problem statements, history, what other people are doing, the psychological implications, demographic information, as well as getting into those things. So health, outcomes. I want to find training. Oh, there was teaching crisis. That's feels like it's getting in the ballpark. Looks like they're just problem discussions in the public policy here. Political origins, attitudes. There's not so much training in here as like, look at what What a huge problem we've just magically discovered. Oh, how interesting. The skin whitening industry in the Philippines. It's international, so gives you a great scope. Education full text tends to be North America centric because of how it was funded in the 70s and the 80s. So let me know how it goes. I think this is a very worthwhile pursuit. And since there's not a lot of information, it might be that you have a novel research idea and that this is a great thing to pursue. So I think my strategy is don't necessarily rely on just social work, because we're talking about a global issue, global in concept. So it's multidisciplinary and it's not just social work. So if you can move beyond those four, I think you'll be in good shape and just look at other disciplines. You could also go into other disciplines like medicine, engineering, and things like that. But the big three were psychology, education, and public policy. Let me know how it goes. I'm excited to help you, and thank you for reaching out.